Okay. Um, it's certainly a pleasure to speak with everyone. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances, but I was asked to talk because just so you understand a little bit about my background and research, what I did is that I myself was sitting with a patient during 9/11 when the plane flew over the building, and I became very curious. I knew what my reactions were, and I wanted to get a sense of what other people's were. So what I did is I did a study with the help of many people, looking at a clinician's exposure to trauma, but we refer to it as shared trauma because it's dual exposure. So I looked at Manhattan clinicians post 9/11. Then I looked at clinicians from New Orleans post Hurricane Katrina. I most recently completed a study of the impact of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. For those of you not familiar with it, it's a 30-year period of sectarian violence that took place in Northern Ireland. So we looked at the legacy of the Troubles to see whether or not there's kind of an intergenerational transmission of trauma around it. And also, I've consulted with groups in Afghanistan, Southern Israel. So basically, where the action is, so to speak, I'm interested in clinicians' experiences based on that. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, I understand I have 30 minutes, so I'm going to summarize this as quick as I can and try to emphasize things that I think will be important for you. But I leave a lot of this for you to do on your own. One of the things we're going to skip over now is something I think is important to do. Oh, sorry. And that is the professional quality of life scale. I don't know if people are familiar with this particular scale. It's wonderful. It looks at compassion fatigue and burnout. It looks at secondary traumatic stress, and it also looks at compassion satisfaction. And the reason I love this instrument, and I used it in all of my studies, is that one of the things that I found in my research is that people can be both traumatized, people can have insecure attachments, but they can also be resilient. So this is important. In other words, the obvious is true. In other words, the more insecurely attached somebody is, the more traumatized they will be. The more traumatized in general, less resilient. But the thing I was particularly interested is for us imperfect providers, can you be traumatized? Can you be insecurely attached, not perfectly attached? And can you also at the same time be resilient? And the answer is yes. So I think this is really important because we're our main instrument in doing the work. So how you are is going to impact the clients that you're interacting with. So it's a terrific instrument. We're not going to do it now. Time doesn't permit, but I'm sure, Margaret, perhaps you can send a link to everybody to take the test. But it's also here if you want to access the slides and the scoring. It gets a little complicated, and everybody who hates math is usually cursing me out as they fill this out during a lecture. But now I'm going to show you some, what we consider pictures related to trauma. And I want you to understand this because this is also why this research is really increasing. This is basically the tsunami that hit a number of years ago, an earthquake in China. This is a bus in Southern Israel. This is a medic who's attending to someone in Iraq. This is the scene of a car accident. This is intimate partner violence, which we see an increase of now, even though it's reported less. We know that many people are afraid to reach out for help. Many of the providers are using codes with their people to help them. Some people have certainly been impacted, by personal theft, etc. Now, the thing that distinguishes COVID, even from the research that I and other colleagues who write in this area have done, is COVID-19 impacts everybody around the world. There is not a continent, maybe except for Antarctica, that has not been impacted by this. And you could see just from 2 days ago, it's basically 4.3 million people around the world were impacted, and it hit over 300,000 deaths. so that there's a large, large impact to what has occurred. So that's what characterizes it differently. Also, the other things that kind of come with it, you know, the isolation, everything else. Now, also important for you to know is when we talk about all kinds of trauma, you know, I just showed you a bunch of pictures. The most important thing is subjectively what constitutes trauma to somebody. Because what is traumatic to you may not necessarily be traumatic to me, may not necessarily be traumatic to the client group you work with. So I think the main takeaway is we have to be respectful of what people define for themselves as traumatic. So for instance, would anybody find this particular symbol traumatic? Everybody knows what that's from, right? Batman. I mean, for me, no, not at all. But if you were sitting in the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, right, and someone shows you the Batman symbol, you might in fact be traumatized by that symbol because it has personal significance for you. It has personal resonance. Similarly, depending on your political persuasions, you might find this particular picture charged. If you're from a racially targeted group, if you are anti-Trump, you might find a picture such as this traumatic. Again, it's in the eye of the beholder. Or someone from someone who is Jewish might look at this and be traumatized by it. Well, we should all be traumatized by it. But all of these depend on who you are, what your prior experience has been, and your level of sensitivity to these things going on. All right. So I can't emphasize that enough. It has to do with the subjective perception. Now, why do they persist? We know that trauma is processed differently, and many of you know this, but just to reiterate, because it's important when we're working with our clients to keep in mind how trauma is processed. If I say where you were September 10th on 2000 or 1999, do you know where you were? Some of you may not have been born then, but let's say you were, right? Do you know where you were? You would probably not remember. But if I say, where were you on September 11th, 2001 at 8:46 in the morning, my hunch is most of you know exactly where you were. You remember who you were with. You might even remember what you were wearing. And that's because anything connected with trauma has a strong negative balance. Trauma is oftentimes sudden and unexpected. And as a result, it's almost like taking a snapshot, and that is, it's basically suspended in timelessness. Traumatic memories are not tied to time. And because of that, they basically are processed differently. They're processed in terms of sights, smells, sounds, somatic sensations, not symbolic level narratives. Because when we ask somebody to describe their traumatic experience, many people say, I just can't describe it to you. You have to have been there. You really wouldn't understand. So that there's a sense that it has to do with basically right side of the brain. Like this is a picture you may remember from the Vietnam War, right? Now, how many millions of pictures have you seen across your life, right? Everybody's seen tons and tons of pictures. Why might we all remember this picture? Think about it. We remember this picture because it's traumatic in nature. So that whatever is traumatic, again, lives in a sense of timelessness. It gets processed on the right side of the brain, where we have holistic thought and creativity, the arts, music, etc. And the goal of treatment is basically to have the right brain talking to the left brain, because here's where you've got your analytic thought and your processing and the language to translate these experiences into language, right? That's the goal of treatment. And that's why such things as art therapy and music therapy, reflective journaling, all of these things, EMDR, can be very, very yoga, meditation, they're all super helpful because what they do is they access the right part of the brain, all right? So keep that in mind in the client groups you work with. the nature of those particular treatments are so helpful for trauma. Now, when something happened like 9/11, and here's an example. Here is somebody, he's going to remember what he saw, what he smelled, but this is the flight, fight response. You see people fleeing. They're not really turning around. One person is, but for the majority, they're running for their lives. So the right side of the brain, again, this is what we refer to as a reptilian brain. When it came into existence, when we came into existence, there were many actual threats out there. So people had to be able to respond rapidly to save your life, right? So if a plane's coming into a building and we're all sitting in the building, nobody's saying, wow, look at that plane. I wonder what make and model it is. No, everybody's running for their lives. When there's a threat to life, there is not time to process it on the left side of the brain. That the activity in that part of the brain shuts down. And what happens is the amygdala and other parts of the right side of the brain get activated such that people can fight, flight, or some people freeze when we talk about a deer in the headlights. But what happens with trauma, it gets internalized and becomes anxiety. So even if the threat has passed, people still feel that there is, that something terrible can happen. So I worked with a lot of groups post 9/11, and what was happening is people were getting triggered. I did one group and somebody said to his colleague, I hate when you wear those red shoes because every time I see them, you were wearing them on 9/11. It reminds me of that day. It reminds me of all the soot and dust on them, and I wish you wouldn't wear them. So you can see something as innocuous as a pair of shoes becomes associated with the trauma, right? So we have to be mindful of what that is. And the goal, of course, there's what we refer to basically as a window of tolerance. So in trauma, not only are people hyper-aroused like you see in anxiety, but you also see what's called a hypoarousal. By that, you see people that are numb, they have flat affect. Many of us work with clients who are telling us horrific stories of abuse. Well, I was raped by my father. I was addicted for a long period of time. I lived out on the streets. I was homeless. And they'll tell you with no affect. That is the hypoarousal that we see that occurs with trauma. All right. So just to be mindful of that. And also importantly, what happens is that this trauma can basically shift intergenerationally. So someone experiencing child abuse can end up with PTSD. They can have problems in school. They can have conduct problems. They can have academic problems. And what can happen in later life, they could drop out of school. They could develop an addiction. They can be drawn to victimizing experiences. Then when they become parents, oftentimes you'll see they're more prone to domestic violence, depression. And if you put in poverty, poverty is a big one. Poverty is trauma. Many of our clients experience poverty as trauma. So you need to think of that as a big T that is occurring for someone. Because if you're not sure where the next check is coming, you feel food insecurity, it becomes a big problem. And a lot of people oftentimes turn to substance use. So what happens is this also can go from one generation to the next. All right. So keep in mind that many of our clients come from backgrounds where there's intergenerational trauma. Now, there are a lot of concepts related to, for anybody working with those who've been traumatized. Burnout, we're all familiar with. That was the first secondary trauma term put forward. And it really means you're kind of, you're kind of done, the end of the line. There's a loss of empathy. There's a difficulty, working with teams. There's a lot of fighting among teams. It's when it's too exhausting. Charles Figley, in turn, developed a term that he called compassion fatigue. And it was intended to encompass burnout, but also to take into account the overall stress of just working with clients in tremendous need. And keep in mind, when we're doing a lot of resource work, we oftentimes have limited resources that we can give to, that we can bring to our clients. And that in itself can be wearing for us when we know that there's limitations to what we can do. There's traumatic countertransference, and that is if you're working directly with a client, you might find yourself experiencing symptoms either of the abuser or of the client themselves. A very common one is rescue fantasies. Those of us who have worked with people who are abused, what do? We very often want to help the person. We want to rescue them. We have negative feelings towards their parents, all of that. Traumatic reenactments is when we are in there with our clients and we're kind of acting out our own stuff. So if somebody is, if we had parents who are very angry and frustrating and we're working with a client who's the same way, it's very easy for us to forget we're working with clients and to get our affect engaged and basically yelling at our clients, yelling at us. More common than you think. People swear it won't happen, but it happens a lot. And it's just something that needs to be worked through. Now, secondary traumatic stress refers to the affective, behavioral, cognitive, somatic, every experience that you can think of that your client may have who's traumatized. We are prone to the same ones, the same kinds of intense emotions, behavioral acting outs, thought processes, spiritual questioning of what we're doing. All of this can come about, and that's part of secondary traumatic stress. Now, vicarious, and I give you all these concepts because there's a lot of confusion among them. There's tremendous overlap between these constructs. But vicarious trauma really looks at permanent alterations that take place in the clinician because of the work we do. So the people who are most prone is if you're highly empathic, you're new to the work. We know this particularly for students, those of you working with students or beginning people in the field, people who are highly empathic, and therapists who have a trauma history are most at risk for vicarious trauma. So we know that going in. I'm sorry. I just have to do something real quick. Okay. Sorry. Welcome to the joys of being in the country. Okay. Now, that brings me to shared trauma. Shared trauma, which I and many other people, started talking about post 9/11, underscores the symmetry of the relationship. So with all of these secondary trauma concepts, there's an underlying assumption. The client is traumatized, but the clinician is not. Here in shared trauma, you are exposed to the same collective trauma as your clients. So you might have asked your clients, your clients might have asked you, where are you staying? How are you faring? What are you doing? How's your family? Have you become sick? Are you worried about becoming sick? They may take the liberty of asking you a lot of questions that they might not. Why? Because they know you've been exposed to the same thing. Now, this is different from a private shared trauma. Let's say if I was abused, right? I was sexually abused and I'm the therapist and you are a survivor of abuse and you ask me, was I abused? I may say no, but I might belie that I was by virtue of my response to the questions. They see my nonverbal cues, right? But they only know if I tell them. Here, they know you've been exposed to COVID in terms of the news. They know you know what's going on. They know you're under the same restrictions they are. So they know you have an opinion and they know you have a reaction. So one of the things I found in my research is that people are much more receptive to talking about their experience. They're more intimate with their clients. And again, the people most at risk, younger age, you have a lot of trauma in your background. And many of our clients are what we would refer to as chronically traumatized. They have so many things going on, they don't even identify it as trauma. they've been exposed to trauma in the workplace, past history, September 11th. And then this is really when this came about, this concept. And I already described it. But important about it is it brings about increased intimacy, but it also brings about an opportunity for reparation on both ends. It brings an opportunity for what I'd refer to as shared resilience. By that, I mean you and your clients together working on coping skills, working on plans of action that make you both feel a sense of agency over what is occurring, right? So shared trauma provides an opportunity for shared resilience. And we know with 9/11, women are more prone to be traumatized. And something, if you're not advising your clients, and I'd advise you to limit your exposure to the media, because it's a repetition of the same thing. It gets scarier and scarier, and you really only need so much information. An overload of information, all it does is in our attempt to master it, people are getting more traumatized. And we know that with 9/11, how many times did people see towers burning, right? We've seen it so many times on television. But what this does is it basically, if you limit it, or you're kind of moderating it for your own kids, there's less of the re-traumatization of it. Very important. So shared trauma, such as 9/11, provider, client are in the same situation, and from it, there's new boundaries that occur. All right, so there's new boundaries that occur from that. And here's, and this is from my 9/11 research. I'm going to read you a couple of these are from open-ended questions, but I just want to give you a sense of what it looks like in action. Professionally, the boundaries between me and my patients came down somewhat as we were going through it together. At the time of 9/11, I was more open to talking about my feelings with patients, and this has continued to this time. So what it does, it's a symmetry, it's a leveling of experience such that they're able to see your humanity in the process. So if they say, are you scared, and you're not, they're going to pick up on it and may experience it as inauthentic. But if you can say, yeah, it's a scary situation, we're not sure, but I trust we will get through it, we'll work on it together, I'll be working with you. There's a reassurance, but an acknowledgement of the feelings that are occurring. So here's someone else saying there's no other thing that has impacted their practice. Me and my patients were in the soup together, so to speak, and my patients and myself talked together about our thoughts, our experiences, and our feelings. So there's a sense that a new level of intimacy was created. Now, some people had a negative reaction. Somebody said, after this trauma, I don't know if I want to do this work. And I've already had a number of colleagues say, I don't know, I think I want to give up my office. I can do this by, teletherapy. I really don't want to deal with people having difficult issues. There's a sense of we get to know ourselves better, because not only do our clients face their limitations and their challenges, but we do as well in this situation. And I want you to keep in mind, we are our only instrument. So our clients are only, if you think about it, they are going to draw their strength from us in many respects. So if our instrument, if we know who we are and we know what our limitations are, that can be very helpful. Now, what's fascinating is the people who had trauma histories. We had somebody who was a Vietnam War vet. We had somebody who was experienced the war in Israel in the 70s. Somebody was a Holocaust survivor. And they all said basically is, been there, done that. So even though this is a new traumatic experience, that was 9/11, they felt inoculated because they had trauma. So I want you to think of it in a bifurcated way, in that you can be, because you had prior traumas, you can be even more traumatized, and/or because you've had traumas, you've been inoculated. When we talk about the antibodies to COVID, it's an antibodies, if you will, to trauma. So depending on the person, those that have the antibodies, so to speak, to trauma tend to be more resilient. And this, of course, Hurricane Katrina. Now, in my research there, what we found is with 9/11, it impacted people, but most people were not relocated. Here, this is in New Orleans, people were relocated. And what we know is that many of the clinicians felt tremendously guilty because they were in fact able to leave they were able to leave NOLA, but many of their clients were left behind. And also this occurs in southern Israel. They talk about something called shared traumatic reality of the work that's been done there. And here you'll see, this is a Qassam rocket that hit the Superior College campus. And what they found there in their work, same thing that's so important. You can be traumatized here, but you can also have post-traumatic growth at the same time. Very important. So in other words, what this research is so consistent with, my background's in social work, it's so consistent with a strength-based model. That's an important takeaway. And that many people to do the work kind of like blocked out the trauma. And this is actually a class from one of my colleagues that I do research with. This is a classroom that was bombed. And they're accustomed to working under these conditions in an ongoing way. One of the things when I've lectured there, I'm told I love high heels, told can't wear them. Why? Because if a siren goes off, you have a short period of time to get a bomb shelter and you can't run very well in high heels, right? Something that comes up as a question for them is you're sitting with a client, the siren goes off and you're saying, come on, we need to get to the bomb shelter. And they say, no, I'm tired of running. I'm just going to sit here. Now, what do you do with that, right? These are questions and concerns that we don't have to deal with on a daily basis, but they do. Okay. In the work I did in Afghanistan, I participated in a UNICEF grant that we were able to develop social work as a profession in Afghanistan. We go and we celebrate in this famous Lebanese restaurant in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and here it is, bombed. I used to sit in traffic every day right over here. Here it is, bombed. So one thing that those people who do this work in other countries know that you are facing the same threat as your clients in an ongoing way. And that is certainly what is happening with COVID right now. And here's just in Northern Ireland. This is what they refer to as the peace wall. It's kind of a euphemism because there's still 90% segregation between the Protestants and the Catholics. There's no localized government because they can't go along. It occurs out of London, and this is the famous bombing in Oman. So there still continues difficulties in all of these areas. Another version of shared trauma, some people experience it politically. I just put a question out on a listserv saying, hey, does anybody have experiences of you and your clients talking about the election? And many of the therapists who were liberally minded gave many instances of them talking with their clients about the election, and both acknowledge feeling duly traumatized by the experience. So understand it takes a lot of forms. Anytime you share some external traumatic, what's perceived as a traumatic event, and again, it's subjective. Whenever you're sharing that with a client, you're in a shared trauma experience. And many people found themselves, again, more intimate, more self-disclosure. That's one thing that these experiences teach us for sure. And post-traumatic growth occurs. So you have changes in terms of a sense of identity, positive changes in relationships and worldviews, political motivations. And I'm looking at the time, so I don't want to, I'll kind of jump over some of this. But people oftentimes were more acutely aware of how short life was. They changed their relationships. People who were living together, decided they were going to get married, that they realized they cared about one another. People basically had concerns about the world, which they felt was benign and safe, suddenly wasn't. So it changes our worldview. How many of us, let's say, were really caught off guard by what happened with COVID? And future changes, people took better care of themselves. People were deciding, I'm not going to practice far from my home. And professionally, we talk about professional post-traumatic growth. People got training, they made all these changes. Now with COVID, I hope many of you haven't experienced it yourself. If you have, with the exception of taste and smell and the Kawasaki-like disease for children, many of this mimics the symptoms of the flu. But we know the death toll that it is taken. But unlike the flu, where there are a large number of cases of people who die every year, what this brings about, and many of our clients experience this, is the stigma. Those who have been exposed, it's like, ugh, everybody's kind of like, ooh, don't go near me. They're afraid of being contaminated. And fear of a stranger is the xenophobia that's occurring. People are talking about COVID nightmares. And our nightmares, if you will, are attempts for us to master something that is so foreign and so new, and we're trying to grapple with it in our sleep. We're continuing the process of trying to master it in our sleep. A lot of people are not taking good care of themselves. If you had mental health issues before, many of our clients do, that's our work, they become exacerbated during this time. And there are, for ethnic groups where there's a mistrust of authorities, one thing that was happening in the African American community is there was something's going out saying, oh, this is a white person's disease, it doesn't impact us. And people took that to heart and were given to conspiracy theories. We know the quarantine and the isolation, especially for someone who is self-isolating to start with, it exacerbates it. It can lead to like boredom and loneliness, strong feelings, and an increase in bad habits, be it drinking, smoking, inactivity, overeating. The one thing that we know that helps in almost every diagnosis there is social support. If you have support from family, friends, colleagues, that can counteract the negative reaction. For instance, in Northern Ireland, many people felt they couldn't talk with their families. They didn't want to worry them. But what happened is they would say, when I did the interviews, they'd say, I go for a pint with my mate every day after work. So the colleagues were the ones that they could be open with and share everything with. They knew, the colleagues knew what was going on. And these people were conducting child welfare visits with bombs going off, with people putting bombs under their cars, with going into paramilitary homes to take away someone's child. I mean, you need a badge of courage for that. And so for them, where they felt they didn't want to burden family and friends, colleagues became their main source of support. So know that for ourselves and our clients, that's really what we want to underscore. And another thing about COVID is it's taking place not just on an intrapsychic level within the person, it takes place interpersonally, it takes place on meso levels in terms of family, community systems, and it takes place on the macro level, with World Health Organization and other responses. So this pandemic impacts every possible level, intrapsychic, interpersonal, micro, macro, meso, everyone you could imagine. And anything going on for a vulnerable population is getting magnified at this time. You think you had limited resources before, well, now you have even more so. And people are adapting. So here's some people meeting, keeping a sense of community together. Here are people banding together because, again, a lot of xenophobia, A lot of people were, a lot of Chinese were blamed for it. So here you see in Chinatown, this is in San Francisco, where they're kind of banding together. Now notice the thing that's important about this is not only are they, you know, this is of course before it really hit the US. So, you know, that's why they're still congregating. But the idea is notice the advocacy, notice the sense of agency that can be created when you're advocating for yourselves and your own community. And that's what they're doing here. And here you can see, you know, sorry, we don't accept Chinese customers. So you can see the fears and whatnot and misinformation. Also that people for the protective equipment, here's somebody trying to work with it, and our healthcare workers have been tremendously impacted. The shortage of personal protective equipment. So it's had a large, large impact, but also people responding and providing all of that for everyone. And people have had to adapt as well in terms of going online, teaching online. I know I'm doing my teaching online, connecting. If you've been to a Zoom cocktail party, I've been to a Zoom bar mitzvah, you know, Zoom Easter I've been to, you know, our lives are being conducted online, but that speaks to our ability to adapt to the circumstance. Very positive. And as much as we can help our clients adapt to that, even better. Okay, goodness, I don't know what happened here. Okay. Okay, here is someone talking with his family. And you can see someone from an older generation. But the people that have been hardest hit, you can see in terms of the ethnicities, those of us working with African American, Latinos, Black and Brown have been hit statistically much more so than white or Asian populations. And we can talk about all of the different reasons. We can talk about access to care. We can talk about living in areas where social distancing is a luxury. And we can also talk about structural racism, equally as valid, if not more so. So we need to be mindful. And we saw this happen with Hurricane Katrina, but you really see it exacerbated here. Hard to miss. Oh my goodness, I don't know what this is. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with the PowerPoint. Okay. So, oops. Sorry, everybody.
It's okay.
Let me try to get back to it. Okay, let me try again. Sorry, I don't know what happened.
And Carol, if yours doesn't work, I can try to share my screen because I have it as well.
Okay, I'm not sure how much time I can just, okay, great, that's wonderful. Yeah, I don't know exactly what happened here. Okay, let's pick it up from, go to slide number 66. And also you tell me when we need to stop because I don't want to detract from what you need.
Oh, no, that's fine. We wanted to make sure we gave you enough time. And I think what we want to do is make sure just the last half hour of the meeting that we have. So we have some more time here.
Okay, so that would be at
Like
1:30?
1:30?
Okay.
Okay. Can you all see this now?
Okay. All right, can I see it now?
I guess it
All
takes.
right, let's see.
Is this the
I
slide?
don't see. Okay, perfect. Okay. All right, and as soon as you hear me talk about it, jump to the next screen, Margaret, because I move quick. Okay. You can look at the unemployment rates, and again, look at the groups hardest hit. Black and Brown, hardest hit. Next. Margaret, hit it.
Oh, I did. Are you the age?
Okay. Okay. Look at it in terms of age. So this is another population. So I mean, institutional racism and also institutional ageism. These are valid factors. because look at who gets hit the hardest. And granted, there's underlying issues that are occurring. And let's go to the next slide. But you can see how it increases with age, the rates of hospitalization as well as death. Okay, Margaret. Okay. Now, attachment is also important. This is just a factor I looked at in the research. Go ahead to the next. Okay.
It's just
Now,
a little slow to change. Sorry about that.
that's okay. This one, and you could go to the next slide on Katrina.
Oh,
Now, what I underlined in the first one in a different color and here too, what you see is that you can be high. We looked at 1 million measures. I'm exaggerating, but people are high on resiliency, compassion, satisfaction, but they could also have compassion fatigue. They could also be traumatized. That's the PCLC. They could also be insecurely attached. So this is what I'm saying that is so important for us as clinicians, as helping providers. We can be both traumatized but effective in helping. Next one, please. So that we can be both. Okay, and the next one. These are the iconic pictures related to 9/11. So we talk about that's rebuilding resiliency, and there's hope for the future. Next one, Margaret, please. Okay. Now, another thing around the impact of COVID-19, we've always talked about fear of missing out, right? Everybody is the fear of missing out. Whoops, can we go back one? The fear of missing out has been replaced by the fear of going out, which is equally valid. And what's the long-term impact going to be? Certainly, there's a global economic impact occurring now. There are rates of unemployment not seen since the Depression. And masks, everything else, may be part of the social fabric. Margaret, next one, please. Okay. So all of these things can come into play. So here you see, this is on the top left, you see an architect's rendering of what buildings are going to look like. Next to it on the top right, this is the distancing you need. And our benches are likely to have dividers in them, as are our tables. Margaret, the next one, please. So you can see the adaptations that will need to take place as a result. So if you are somebody, and another thing that speaks to it, if you can see the woman, the smallest picture there, she's got a fashionable outfit, but so she has a fashionable mask that that coordinates with her outfit. People making social statements with their masks, and what you see is there's something. Since we are living online, how do you feel about doing telehealth? How do you feel about connecting with people online? One thing is people are talking about it as more challenging, but in another, it's really also more intimate. Here's somebody who doesn't realize that he's in his little skivvies there, he's in his underwear, but he thinks he's covered for the camera, but he isn't. Next slide, please. So you can see there's an increasing level of intimacy. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. What you see is that in terms of self-care leading to well-being, and the other one is no self-care leading to negative outcomes. Now, and please go to the next slide. Now, who of us are not guilty? I spend every day with my clients, with my students, with other groups, basically telling everybody, you have to take care of yourself. What do we say? Physical health, do this, do that, right? We all know what we need to do. We need to eat well. We need to get plenty of rest. We need to exercise. We need to do mindfulness. We need to do all of these things. And here's a good summary of all the healthcare strategies. Awareness with journaling, creative writing, have a work-life balance, if you will, to be flexible, to take care of our health, to take care of ourselves. And social supports, again, can underscore that enough. and spirituality to find, and I'm sorry, if we can go to the next slide. Those that have, there's a wonderful saying by Viktor Frankl, those who have any why can bear any how. And I may be butchering it, but you get the gist. Meaning that if there is a purpose to your life, you can tolerate what is going on. If your life has meaning and there's a reason to live. So here's like taking care of your body. These are all the things to take with you. Limiting social media, all that stuff we were talked about. Unwind, connect with others. Please, next slide. But I mean, I can just tell you from personal experience, while I say these things, oftentimes what I'm doing is I'm sitting eating Ben and Jerry's chocolate therapy and sitting and watching the Kardashians, not necessarily them, but something mindless, because that's what I need to do, right? I responded to the call for volunteers for New York State, but I just don't have it in me to volunteer because I know my limits. I know unless I'm taking care of myself, it's not going to be helpful. One of the practices that I'm going to leave you with is mindfulness. We know that it's very useful for our clients in terms of reducing anxiety, chronic pain, calming the body, decreasing stress, all of that. Next slide, please. But it also, not only is it effective for our clients, it's effective for us. So self-care for clinicians is very, very important. All right, so it teaches us self-compassion, gives us an opportunity to be imperfect, or as I say, perfectly human. It helps us recognize we're acting as skillfully as we can. Because the demand is so great and people's needs are so great, we can only give what we are able to give. Next slide, please. And now there are a couple ways in which people, there are a couple of things to practice different mindfulness. Okay, this is just a research to show everything it's done. Next slide, please, Margaret. And we're getting there. We're almost done. It's something we need to do that you can integrate into your everyday life. Next slide, please. And I highly recommend the app Calm. It's just absolutely terrific. And there are things that, Margaret, okay, great. Deep breathing, next slide. And there's so many ways to do it. Deep breath in, twice as long coming out of the mouth. Body scans starting from basically our feet all the way up. We become mindful of where tension is. Breathe deeply to reach that area, release the tension. And I'm going to leave you, and there's links here, so you're welcome. If any of these resonate with you, you want to use them, please take them with you. And the last one, okay. This is a great one. It's a self-compassion pause. Basically, you take deep breaths. We can do it right now. Just take a couple deep breaths in. Release through your mouth or your nose, whichever is better. Take about 5 deep breaths and release. Now I want you to think about if you had a loved one who's hurting or a client who's hurting, what kind of self-compassion would you give them? I'm sure you'd be empathic. You'd try to understand. You'd feel badly for them. You wouldn't want to hurt. We need to acknowledge that for ourselves. We need to treat ourselves like we are in fact that client in need. And basically some of the mantras that people use, and what it is physically, for those of you alone now who've lacked physical contact, many people have during this period, because now another thing is an act of love is to keep away from someone rather than embracing them. So you need to give yourself a big hug and say, may I hold myself with compassion? May I accept myself as I am? May I treat myself with love and kindness? And may I be open to my experience just as it is. In other words, just as it is okay, especially now. And we really need to internalize that and take it in before we go about our daily lives. And that's pretty much it. You can flip the slides, but those are the references that I've used in the presentation, and references if you want to do further reading. You're more than welcome to. Okay. So that's it for me. And then let me just kind of open it up to questions, and then you guys kick me off whenever you have more work to do.
Before anyone starts with the questions, Carol, I want to thank you. That was really fantastic. And a great slideshow too. Lots of visuals, really talking about sort of the somatic side of things, really connecting with the sensory. I know you and I and Kate talked earlier, and you know this is an audience that's really mixed. So I think it's just worth highlighting that everything you're saying here for clinicians, we've got clinicians here, we have first responders, we have people who run support groups, we have people who've, had these experiences of trauma personally, and it feels like everything you said applies to everyone in a million ways, and we're all in this together right now.
Absolutely. Although my research is for clinicians, it applies to anyone in a helping capacity. Yeah. Anyone.
And which is the whole group here.
Right.
So you guys, let's take 10 minutes for your questions and answers.
Any questions or anything? And I'm sorry you guys all froze. But any questions that I can answer or comments, please?
Yeah, you have to unmute yourselves if you have a question.
Okay.
So this is Kathy. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Let me see if I can put me on. So I like your terminology that you use. Everybody uses self-care, but you used it as self-compassion. And I like that term because to me, it even goes further than just care. You're also taking care of all the various aspects and realizing the stress that we're all under with our various jobs, roles.
Absolutely.
Networks and,
Absolutely.
Interpersonal relationships. So I do like how you encompass that.
Kathy,
That's
I'm
excellent.
sorry you froze. You guys all froze right now. Welcome to I'm right now in rural Pennsylvania, far from Manhattan. I'm sorry, but Kathy, what were you asking me?
Oh, I wasn't. I was just saying, I thought this was
about
great.
Compassion being a...
Yeah, and you use the word self-compassion. I'm always hearing self-care, but I like the word self-compassion because it has a different connotation to it.
Well, I always feel like it's such a hypocrite because I'm always like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, but I'm not doing it myself. Why I don't have time to do it, but I'm busy telling everyone else they need to do it for themselves. And they in turn are telling their clients they need to do, but they're not doing it. You know what I'm saying? We need to be real about what we're doing.
Right. No, this was excellent. Thank you so much for doing it. Really excellent.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah, and if I could be helpful to any other group, I'm more than glad to do that. We're in virgin territory,
Right. Right.
No one really knows. We're kind of muddling as we go along. I also edit the Clinical Social Work Journal, and we sent out a call for papers, if people were interested in contributing to the journal. And in like 48 hours, we got over 100 submissions.
Wow.
I'll send you a link to a podcast I did for Jonathan Singer. He has the social work podcast. They had 11,000 downloads in 3 days.
Wow.
So, what it is everybody is hurting and everybody is like, what are we doing? You know what I mean? We're all in the unknown together.
Yeah.
Right.
I think you highlighted that so well about what's so different about this, that we're all involved everywhere and everywhere literally in the world. And I really appreciate this sort of positive side of things where you're saying, at the same time that you can have the compassion fatigue, at the same time, there's the opportunity as well as the opportunity or the, and I think, for some people are seeming pretty resilient. People have to know that no matter what happens going forward, that
Come on, Mama.
I think just reframing for ourselves and others that there's positivity here too is important. But
Absolutely. Well, that's why I have a colleague in Israel who writes about shared resilience. And shared resilience is all about something that you're doing with your clients together. Somebody's got their dog there. Sounds like in their kids.
It's Danique's kids. I'm gonna mute her. I muted her.
No, obviously not. Can you hear me? I have a question.
Yes.
You can hear me.
Yes.
So I actually typed it out and sent it to you in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Can you see that?
Sue, I don't see your chat.
Okay.
Oh, maybe private.
Okay.
I can just say it instead.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for sharing, Susan. And I'm going to say this is that, there are many people, and I have friends that, live alone, that are giving up on meeting somebody kind of thing, and they're on their own. And they're saying, what's the sacrifice? I've learned to be very self-reliant. I'm self-sufficient. I know how to take care of myself. So being isolated is not a challenge for me. It's the norm. So they're feeling better prepared to deal with it. So I think that's something for us to just kind of keep in mind for ourselves and our clients, is that if somebody who really prides themselves on independence and self-reliance, that it may not feel like such a sacrifice, if you will, and I think that's important, because that's drawing on resiliency. That's drawing on that strength. So, and I think for ourselves and our clients, that's something that we want to take what people use, right? To build, now's the time to build on the strengths, because to work on the issues, you got to fortify somebody to work on those issues.
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions?
I have a question. And I'm curious, it's about trauma and how to prevent trauma from becoming.
Oops, I'm sorry, you froze.
Me? Am I still frozen?
Sorry, guys, I'm sorry, you're still frozen. I've learned that people can hear me when you're frozen, so I'm sorry, please repeat it again.
I'm not sure if you can hear me now. So I guess I'm curious about ways that we can prevent this from becoming traumatic, like besides exercising self-care, which actually I now call self-preservation. I don't think it's just self-care, it's preservation of ourselves. And so, I mean, besides, are there other things that we can do? The way that we process that, how can we process this differently in our brains? I mean, one of the things I've tried to talk about is looking for mastery in a way of how we can find meaning in this experience of what
Absolutely.
Can we learn from this? But do you have any other ideas?
Having that philosophical worldview that you can put it in context is important. One of the things is, I think mastery is important in the sense that, well, let's see, how do I put it? I think it's obviously a challenge for us, and I think there's some degree of trauma associated with what's occurring, because it has the elements, it's sudden, it's unexpected. We don't even know the full details of what we're dealing with, right? But the idea is like, what can we do? And one of the things I said is know your limitations. Because what I found in my research is there were some people, they were too traumatized to work. And they were like, I just need to sit back. But then there were many more who said, I'm traumatized, but you know what helps me? Going to work. My identity is as a helper. So when I go out and I help others, that's helping me in the process of helping them, right? So that we need to know about, because we have the luxury of having an identity that allows us to not just sit in fear, but to take action, right? And to see that we can make an impact with others, that we can make a positive impact. So that's a big plus, right? So the extent to which we can have a sense of agency around what we're doing, that helps us, right? Just like if the saying, you lose it if you don't, if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing. The idea is if we're active during this and we continue to do the work, that helps us in the process, So that's one thing for sure. And then also, I think just anything outside of non-work that gives us pleasure. Like right now, thank God, it's, getting warmer. The beaches are going to be open. You know what I mean? Everything that just gives us a sense beyond the trauma of it, like to immerse ourselves in those kinds of things.
Like your five senses or something like that. Like
I'm
your
sorry?
sensory. Like five senses, like your sensory,
right.
like different things.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason why is because you're engaging the same senses that are associated with trauma, but positively, right? So remember when I said like art therapy and music therapy, and what's wonderful is seeing that the whole collective. So you can access free operas and free jazz and free art exhibits and free zoos, and like everybody's just kind of pitching in so that there's this wonderful sensory stimulation to remind people of, other possibilities.